I'm talking today about the rise and fall of human intelligence. This is a lead-in to a bigger topic, which is our civilization is collapsing. What kind of solutions will be appropriate? I'll jump ahead to my conclusion, which is that it's collapsing due to evolutionary reasons. We're getting stupider, and therefore political solutions aren't going to work. You cannot solve evolutionary problems with political solutions. Darwin said 150 years ago that except in the case of man, nobody is so stupid as to breed their worst animals. Repeat that. Except in the case of man, no one is so stupid as to breed his worst animals. Darwin said that 150 years ago, half a century into the Industrial Revolution. What he feared is coming true. We have had another century and a half of breeding our worst animals, the worst aspects of humanity, and we are living with the results. What did he mean by the worst? One measure is intelligence. What is intelligence? Intelligence is the general ability to solve problems. It's measured by IQ tests, not identical to intelligence, but the best measure we have. And they measure in three major domains, those being vocabulary or verbal ability, mathematical ability, and spatial ability. The ability to put thoughts into words and to understand what others are saying, the ability to solve mathematical type problems, and the ability to put things together in space. Those are the three major components of intelligence tests that have been in use for more than 100 years. And although they do not perfectly measure intelligence, they're the best that we have, and measured intelligence, IQ, correlates better than anything else with what we deem success in life. That is educational attainment, income, marital stability, avoiding crime, the other things that we would say are the characteristics of a successful person. This has a deep evolutionary history. Hunter-gatherers needed intelligence. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors were about as smart, about as big-brained as we are, and their brains were 3.5 times bigger than the chimpanzees, who were our last common ancestor 7 to 10 million years ago. That's the difference between 1/3 of a liter and 1 1/3 liters, more or less. A vast leap in brain size. It must be good for something. And yes, it was. The chiefs, the leaders of hunter-gatherer tribes we see today are the most capable people among them. They are the best hunters, the best warriors, and the best at making alliances with other people, the best at working out plans and cooperating with one another. So the leaders in hunter-gatherer groups are the people we would consider successful. And the rewards of success for them are multiple wives. Not only do they get to have more wives than the average, but they get their pick of the wives. They get the smartest, the most capable women, and it does exactly what Darwin would have you do with your animals: improve the breed. The smarter ones had more children. This carried on in the age of agriculture because we kept making our environment more complex. We invented things like boats and plows and pottery and weaponry like swords, metallurgy. It took more and more brains to master all of the things that we learned how to do. And it was the smartest among us who mastered them. And these smartest had more children. So the smarter having more children and the dumb ones not being able to find a mate led to increasing intelligence throughout the ages. Throughout the age of agriculture, it generally turned out that the rich men, the capable men, had more wives, just as among the hunter-gatherers. Some had harems of hundreds of women. So the best genes, the smartest genes, got propagated. And we developed social institutions, such as marrying in among the Jews, the Parsis, and the castes of the Hindus to keep the high intelligence within those groups intact by letting them breed together. Once again, going back to what Darwin would say. In Christianity, we had monogamy. We were confined to one wife at a time. However, we found ways around that. Rich men usually managed to find mistresses on the side. It was condoned until a century or so ago. And those of us who are strictly bound by monogamy have serial marriages where we have only one wife at a time, but we may have more than one wife. At any rate, the smarter among us until the last century continued to have more children. Intelligence is highly heritable. 80% of intelligence is as a consequence of your DNA. It's inherited. The other 20% they just don't know about, but they know that it's not your environment. Twin studies offer the best proof of this. There have been many cases of identical twins separated at birth, the same genome, the same DNA, and they may be brought up by different families in different countries and different socioeconomic status, and yet when they come together as adults and they're measured, their IQs are within a point or two of each other. And this is the best proof that there is that it's genetic, it is not environmental. It makes sense. What the breeders knew, what Darwin knew, is that you want to have your best stock breed together. You can measure intelligence by, first, what people attain, and second, by actual physical measurements. So talking about what people can attain, let's look at how intelligence grew over the centuries. We became more literate. In 1720, about 60% of Englishmen could read. By 1920, it was almost 100%. Not only can we read, but we use a more extensive vocabulary. There have been written texts around since Chaucer's time, and they got more complex. They used more and more sophisticated language over the centuries, to the point that by the 19th century, we were at a high water mark, and we used a more extensive vocabulary in our literature than is used in today's literature. The authors of those days expected an intelligent readership. They would throw in not only highly complex, kind of rare words, but they called on the reader to know the Bible and to know history and to know literature. Mark Twain made references to the Duc and Dauphin of France and to biblical characters, references that today's audience wouldn't understand. So literacy grew. The amount of arithmetic we were able to do and needed to do in life grew. As businesses became more complex, household finances became more complex, you had to make financial decisions at a minimum. A farmer had to figure what to sow, what profit he might get. So there was a lot of arithmetic involved in life, and the smarter people who mastered the arithmetic had more successful lives and left more children. The level of genius rose. People invented stuff. The 19th century was the apogee, the highest rate of inventions. They discovered most of the elements. They described electricity and tamed electricity, learned how to generate electricity. We developed radio, we developed telegraph, we developed the phonograph, the telephone, we developed the steamship, the locomotive. The 19th century was really the high point in human inventiveness. So those are things that we observe about human accomplishment. Now there are also measurements that we can make are correlated with intelligence. One of them is tone discrimination, how well you can recognize different tones, kind of things that a musician or a piano tuner knows. Color recognition is correlated with intelligence. Your laptop computer can display just short of 17 million different colors. And how well you can discriminate between those colors is correlated with how intelligent you are. Reaction time is correlated with intelligence. They've been measuring the reaction time for 140 years. The experiment's pretty simple. The experimenter flashes a light and you push a button in response to the light. The quicker your response, the smarter you are. The correlation with measured IQ is fairly high. And what they found, incidentally, is that in the 140 years they've been measuring it, our reaction times have gone up, which means our intelligence has gone down. Our brain size went up. They measured skulls of Englishmen of a millennium ago and then Chaucer's time and modern, and they've grown by about 10 millimeters over that millennium. The bigger your brain is, the smarter you are. Now, comparing individual people, the differences aren't that great. The correlation between IQ and brain size is only about 0.2. But among populations, it is very big. Intelligence of populations is very highly correlated with the average brain size of that population. In particular, Northeast Asians and Europeans have bigger brains on average than the rest of the world. Another thing to note is that the measured IQ of everybody in the world averages about 82. The measured intelligence of Englishmen and Americans, this is where the intelligence tests are made, is around 100. And there are populations such as Chinese, Japanese, and Jews who have higher measured intelligence. So all of this stuff is known. Your short-term memory is a measure of intelligence, and this is something that they use on intelligence tests. They will give you a series of numbers and ask you to repeat them backwards. The more numbers you can remember, the smarter you are. Here's a more practical use. How well do you remember names? If you go into a room and you're introduced to 5 people, do you remember their names? Again, still more practical. You go out for a night on the town and you meet 3 pretty girls and you ask for their names and telephone numbers. Can you remember those names and telephone numbers long enough to write them down? That's a test of intelligence. Another measurable thing is the frequency of high intelligence alleles in your DNA. Now, how smart a person is a function of thousands of different alleles in your DNA. They're able to identify a handful of them that are characteristic of high intelligence people, and they're able to measure how frequent those alleles are in a population and whether an individual has them or not. And more than that, they're able to do this with ancient DNA that's recovered from scraps of bones and so on of Neanderthals going forward. And what they find is that the frequency of alleles associated with high intelligence went up over time until the Industrial Revolution. Since then, it's kind of plateaued and going down. So all of these physical measurements that I've named, that would be tone discrimination, color discrimination, reaction time, frequency of alleles, and brain size, are measurable. You can't fudge these things. And they all went up over time, correlated with intelligence. That is, until the Industrial Revolution, the time Darwin expressed his concern about the future of the human race. What happened in the Industrial Revolution? Public health got a lot better. We developed running water, we developed sewer systems, and we developed medicines. so that instead of 50% of children dying before they reached adulthood, it fell to 10%, and now it's down to about 1%. That 50% who died used to be the children of the poor and the people who couldn't take care of themselves. Basically, the stupider died off, the smart lived to reproduce. That's not happening anymore. What else happened? Having a large family was no longer a sign of wealth, no longer a status symbol. People found other things to do. So the smart people didn't have as many children. Starting in France about 1820, Napoleon lamented it. Meanwhile, the dumb people started to get welfare from the government. This started with Henry VIII's poor laws 4 centuries ago. So the poor people, the dumb people, were subsidized for having children, and the smart people no longer had much incentive. There was no longer status in having children, and status and fashion have a lot to do with whether or not you have children. So it became unfashionable to have a lot of kids, except for the lower classes who didn't know any better. Homosexuality, different sexuality became popular, and it's more popular among the more intelligent. So if they're right that IQ has fallen on average about 15 points, what does this mean? It means that a high school teacher of 100 years ago would be a college professor today. And a policeman of 100 years ago would be a teacher today. And a security guard of 100 years ago would be an ordinary policeman or a clerk today. So everybody is now working at a higher level position than they would have 100 years ago, because those positions need to be filled, and you fill it with what you've got. So if this is the case, then you have less competent people doing things, and we notice that our infrastructure is falling apart. You don't get good service from the government. I just filled out forms for the IRS about my 2020 taxes. That's 3 years ago. It took them a year to respond to my last letter. Things are falling apart. And they're falling apart more quickly year after year. We see increasing crime on our streets, fraud in our elections, one thing and another. You could attribute it to bad actors, and certainly there are bad actors there, but a lot of it's just inability to do this stuff that we used to do, that we used to take for granted. So that's where I'll leave it. And repeat that, keep in mind, if this is decreasing intelligence, a political solution isn't going to work. Smart people can make anything work. Smart people make communism work in China just like they make capitalism work in Taiwan. Smart people made communism work in East Germany. Not as well as West Germany, but not bad. Meanwhile, in the global South, whatever systems they try don't work. The people aren't smart enough to implement them well. So there's general corruption and things don't work. So a political solution is not going to get us out of this morass we're in. What we need to do is recognize it's an evolutionary problem. Once we do that, we'll stop wasting our time. What do we do? That's a big question. Madam Toastmaster.